stop talking. I should have.
Right. Hello, everybody. Now we're ready to go. Welcome. My name is Todd Rubold with the Institute on the Environment. Welcome to our online audience. Speaking of the online audience, when it gets time for the Q&A, wait for me to come around with the microphone so they can hear your question too. If you're tweeting about today's session, which you should be doing, would be great. Please use the hashtag Frontiers up here on the board.
And my name's right there.
Katharine's handle is down there at the bottom too. It's now my pleasure to introduce our featured speaker for the day, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. Dr. Hayhoe is a renowned climate and atmospheric scientist. She's an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and director of the Climate Science Center at Texas Tech University, and also founder and CEO of ATMOS Research. If you look back over the past few years, you know how they put together these top 10 lists, top 100 lists, top 20 lists. Pretty much any list that you look for related to climate and environment, her name is going to be on it. I was going to read all the lists, but she said to shorten it up, so. With that, one more thing I should point out. She is Canadian, very important, via Texas. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hayhoe to the University of Minnesota.
Thanks for that intro, Todd. How does that sound, okay? Okay. So I am an atmospheric scientist. My background is originally in physics and then in atmospheric science. My real job, so to speak, is focusing on testing global climate models, generating high-resolution climate information, working with everybody from ecologists to city planners to figure out how we can use this information to plan for a more resilient future. So I spend a lot of my time talking to city water departments, engineers, Department of Defense people who run infrastructure and installations, talking about integrating high-resolution climate information into future planning. Along the way, moving to Texas being the trigger, I developed a second career, accidentally, the way those things kind of sneak up on you when you're not looking. My second career is talking to people, many of whom live in Texas, who don't think that climate change is real, and who have heard a lot of information about how we can't be the type of person we are and agree with the science of climate change. This talk today, though, is going to be a little bit unusual because it is neither one nor the other. This talk is, for me, the fun talk because I'm going to talk to you about what I imagine you are most interested in too, which is how do we talk to people about this? So if I could just see a show of hands, who here is a researcher or an academic? Lots. Who here works in, and this may be overlapping, who here works in some type of environmental area? Okay, perfect audience, perfect talk, we're good. I'm not going to ask for a poll on whether you think climate change is real. But we are going to get into that tomorrow night. So tomorrow night I am speaking over at the Student Union at 7 o'clock, and that is a much more general public talk about how do we know that climate is changing, why do we think it's humans, why does it matter to us, and what can we do about it. So that's tomorrow night. So how can we change people's minds on climate? First of all, we have to recognize that we live in a very different world, a very different culture or society today than we did 20 years ago. Just about all of us in this room are over the age of 20. Not that anybody looks like it. But if we are over the age of 20, which I don't mind admitting I am, we've realized that things have changed. Now, I'm not talking about technology, although that has certainly changed. I'm not talking about, our phones and our cars and our internet and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about something that is very fundamental to the fabric of any society, and that is our polarization. So 22 years ago, when they first started doing this poll, they said, what does the political landscape of the United States look like? And in the United States, there are only two major parties. And the two major parties look like this. Nice, normal distributions, fairly symmetrical. And the medians were quite close together. Fast forward in time to 2011 and then 2014. We don't have anything newer than that. What has happened to these distributions? Two things have happened. Number one, the medians have moved farther apart. But even more disturbing, I think, for any of us familiar with statistics, is that both of these distributions are no longer nice and normal. They are skewed. And they are skewed way out to the edges. Today, we live in a society here in the United States that is so polarized that for the first time in the history of when they've been doing these surveys, the number one predictor of who we will marry if we are not already married is no longer appearance, it's not interests, it's not race, it's not socioeconomic status, it's what political party you belong to. Yeah. As a naive Canadian moving to the States, I was not aware of this fact. So I married a conservative Republican. Those of us from Canada will know, in Canada, you don't actually identify as I am a blank belonging to a specific political party. It's very acceptable to vote for multiple parties in your lifetime, and I have done that myself. And that is not actually part of our identity, typically. There's a few exceptions, but typically it isn't. Whereas in the United States, it's hard to get to know somebody in any conversation that lasts any longer than about half an hour without actually finding out I am a Democrat, Republican, or Independent. So we're in this situation now where who you marry really depends on who you vote for, which is crazy. And in this situation, we have many very difficult conversations taking place. We have conversations relating to immigration, to refugees, to gun control. Where I live in Texas, we have very difficult conversations relating to energy and the economy, water, and agriculture. We have Ag Awareness Week, too, at our university. And I was just there on Monday. So how polarized is climate change today? Well, 2 years ago, one of my colleagues did a survey. And he asked people what they thought about various pertinent social issues today. And then he divided their answers up into whether they were Democrat or Republican. And then he ranked the issues based on which ones. There's like 5 seats at the front, people, if you want seats. Be brave. Be brave. He ranked the issues based on which ones people were most divided on. So the number one issue he found that was the most polarized issue in the entire country should be number one. And And what is it? It's, do you approve of the president? Now, it's sad that this is so polarized, but it should be polarized because otherwise, why are you Democrat or Republican, right? I mean, that's kind of the definition. So that's okay. The rest of it is not so okay. Here we go. Yes. Now, you may think number 2, climate change, is the saddest, but for me personally, number 4 is the saddest. Do you trust scientists? I mean, since when has a specific profession, whether you trust them or not, become a political issue? You know, do you trust your pharmacist? Do you trust your physician? Do you trust your accountant? These aren't on the list. They probably didn't even think about asking the question. And so today, when we have conversations with people in our family, our neighbors, the parents of our kids' friends, and even some of our colleagues, and we start to touch on any of these difficult issues, our conversations often look like this. I have a little son, and he just rediscovered Calvin and Hobbes. I'm so happy. Yes, I still have some of my old books. So what do? When we have these conversations, I, Susie the scientist, what do? I pull out all my facts and my data. And what does the person I'm talking to do? They pull out their identity, who they are, what's important to them. And the conversations I have, these are literally all the IPCC reports. Seriously, if you stack these things up, they would be as tall as I am. That's how many IPCC reports we have. So we're tempted to just pull out the IPCC reports or whatever scientific facts or data or information we have, whether it's about climate or another topic, and just kind of take it out and just whack people over the head with it. Well, then, you know, they feel defensive. And what do we pull out? We pull out, well, that's not the way the world is. That's not who I am. That's not what I believe. And what are we doing when we have these types of conversations? We're digging a trench. We are digging a trench that gets deeper and deeper, and the end of the conversation typically looks something like this. So let's translate that into us as scientists, researchers, or people who work in the environmental field. What does a typical climate talk look like? And for many of us, you could just take out climate and put just talk, any type of talk. What does it look like? Well, we usually start with facts and information. You know, we know that burning coal and gas and oil produces carbon dioxide. And I don't mean to slam any of this because these are slides that I use in my own presentations. We know that we've been burning a lot of this stuff over the years. These are our carbon emissions from human activities. We know that our planet has this natural greenhouse effect, and we are artificially adding to it. And we know that when we look at carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere and when we look at global temperature, they're both going up. And furthermore, we know from ice core data that, yes, we have regular cycles of hot and cold. We have regular cycles of high and low CO2. But we know that today we're looking at a situation that is very unprecedented. In fact, if you look at the scientific literature, there is ample evidence that we should be heading into the next ice age. Not today, not tomorrow, but over geologic time frames, the next event on our calendar is a glacial maximum. And in fact, we're heading far in the other direction. Now, in the typical scientific talk, we then insert blue slides with yellow text. I'm not looking at anybody here. Which are largely incomprehensible, in which we have tried to squeeze every single word we thought of saying. Our slides typically focus on the 10% that we don't know, because that's the interesting stuff, and that's why we're researchers. We aren't researchers to talk about what we do know. In fact, I'm going to be totally honest with you. I don't think I've ever said this before. Sometimes I bore myself when I'm talking about basic climate science. I'm like, I've been talking about this stuff for so long, sometimes halfway through I'm just like, I'm bored. So what do? I change up my presentations all the time. I hardly ever give the identical presentation. I usually change them up, add this, fix that, make this better, to entertain myself. What I'm interested in is what we don't know, and that's what all of us are interested in. But in doing so, we don't focus on what we do know, and we don't realize that most people we're talking to for outside of our very small discipline, they don't know the 90%. Then at the end, if we're feeling adventurous, we may have a conclusion. Our conclusion we might go as far as to say climate change is important, and if we're in the mood to be a little bit risky, we might even say that we should do something about it, but don't ask me what, because I'm a scientist. What assumptions are we making when we approach a conversation? This doesn't have to be a talk. It could be a conversation. It could be something we're writing. It could be any way or means in which we are communicating with another human being. What are our assumptions? Assumption number 1, everybody thinks like we do. Very normal human assumption. Well, what I love about science is that you can test this. So this is a paper done by Susan Weiler and a bunch of others who ran the NSF Discourse program, which was a great early career training workshop that went on for 8 years, and I was fortunate enough to be able to participate as a mentor in the last year. So they examined a large cohort, over 200 early career researchers that were interested in interdisciplinary research. So they're picking people who are already, when I went, most of the people there were already blogging, they were already doing short little video abstracts, they were already hip, they were with it, they knew about communication. What did they find? Given that our personality type affects our preferred way of presenting and receiving information, differences in our personality types might have important implications for our communication. And what did they find? They tested 209 early career researchers. They found that their personality type profile was significantly different than the average US population. And again, these are people who are really into communication already. Researchers tend towards intuition, which means looking to the future and focusing on theories and the big picture. Does that sound familiar? That's what makes us good scientists, especially good interdisciplinary scientists. But the average public tends towards sensing, which is looking to the present, and focusing on concrete examples and experiences. So when we see a headline like this, and as a scientist we're like, oh my goodness, who would ever even, guess what? It resonates. Because say what you will, he understands that people think about concrete examples in the here and now. And that makes him a better communicator than just about all of us. So they went on. I don't normally go through papers in such detail, but I think this one is very relevant. So after the slides, you'll feel like you've read it. You can talk to people about it. They went on to say these differences exacerbate the challenge of effectively communicating, especially on an issue like climate change. But if we understand our assumption, and we understand that other people might not think like we do, we can work to improve our communication. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. There aren't universal strategies, and even the strategy I lay out today is intended to be customized and tailored to you. So I'm giving examples, but I'm not saying this is what works because it works for me. You have to figure out how to apply it to you, and we'll talk about that. But being aware of this helps. So assumption number 1, everybody's like us. Assumption number 2, everybody understands what we say. No, they don't. So when we spend 10% of our time talking about what we know and 90% talking about what we don't know, what happens? Results like this. The public in the United States right now thinks that scientists are 50-50 on the issue of climate change. Why? Because whenever we open our mouths, we're saying, well, you know, there's this and there's that, and you can't really say this, but you have to consider that. All of that adds up to you don't know what you're talking about. Whereas the other head on the other side of the television is very firm, very direct, very clear. It's a hoax. It's not real. They're lying. That's a very simple message, as opposed to the, well, yes, humans are contributing, but we're not exactly certain how much, and yes, there could be other factors. I mean, compare those two. The reality, of course, is that the vast majority of scientists do agree. And survey after survey has been done, and the numbers come out somewhere between 97 and 100%. Being a scientist, I'm being conservative, and I always pick the lowest number. It isn't just about the way we talk about uncertainty. This is a very helpful table in a paper by Susan Hassel and Richard Somerville. In it, Susan and Richard have this table where I'm just going to highlight a couple of these for you. They have words that mean one thing to us, a totally different thing to the average person. Uncertainty to us means the range, right? But to the average person, it means ignorance. Why do you have this person talking about this stuff? They obviously have no idea what they're talking about. Let's look at another one. Error. Error is the difference from the true number. Everything has an error on it, right? If it doesn't have an error, you're not a true scientist. What does error mean? It means mistake, wrong, incorrect. And then here's the last one, bias. Bias just means offset to us. You know, the GCMs have a bias relative to the observations. Bias means a distortion with a political motive. You see?
My favorite is positive feedback.
Oh yeah, that one's right there. Positive feedback. Good response, praise. So there's positive feedbacks in the Arctic. Isn't that great? So you get the picture here, right? Then the other assumption we make is that people are blank slates. In other words, they're just waiting for the correct information to be written on them. This theory has been around in the field of science education for a very long time. And my mouse just stopped clicking. There we go. It's known as the knowledge deficit model. And it basically goes like this. People are willing and available to process information if it's available. But if we have a lack of public support, which we do, this is a Gallup, I'm going to go back there, so don't worry. This is a Gallup study asking people, do you think the seriousness of global warming is exaggerated or correct? And the numbers saying it's exaggerated have been very high for the last 5 years. So when we see something like this, the knowledge deficit model tells us they just need more information. So if they need more information, what should we do? Well, I'm sorry, this is not my computer. I'm having a couple of problems. Well, the original IPCC reports that we last saw with Susie, well, they clearly weren't enough. So they did another set a few years after the first ones in 1990. And then they did another full set in 95, but those weren't enough to change public opinion. So then there was 2000, and then there was 2005, and then there was 2013. But maybe they didn't have an impact on public opinion in the United States because they're United Nations reports. So if we just did one national climate assessment, or 2 national climate assessments, or 3, or last Monday and Tuesday, I just spent the whole day in the 4th national climate assessment meeting. Maybe if we just did that, that would change people's minds. Well, but those are government reports. Maybe we need a unbiased, independent organization like the National Academy of Sciences to do a report, or to do another report, or to do another report. You get the picture here, right? That is our response if we truly believe, as many of us do, that more information will change people's minds. Why do we believe that? Because as a scientist or as an academic, it does or it should, right? We all have personalities. We're all resistant to ideas that we don't agree with. But the hallmark of a good researcher is that if the data disagrees with your theory, you change your mind, not the data. That is not the way the rest of the world works. So, again, thankfully, social science can help us out. And social science, there we go. Social science has examined this issue. This is a paper by Dan Kahan and colleagues that they published a couple of years ago. And they tackled this issue head on. They said, public apathy over climate change is often attributed to a deficit in comprehension. People know too little science. So what's the answer? More science, write another report. Do education. Use color figures. Maybe have a video. Get an educational specialist on board. Translate it into more readable language. You get the picture. It's all aimed at literacy. Here's what I love about social science. We conducted a study to test and found no support for this. No support. In fact, members of the public with the highest degree of science literacy were not the most concerned about climate change. Rather, they were the ones among whom cultural polarization was greatest. So no, people are not blank slates. Our blank slates have been written on for decades by extremely intelligent hands. What is PR other than a way to write on people's minds what you want them to think or feel? So starting with a memo to President Bush by Frank Luntz, who is a PR genius, which proposed to the president, you don't have to say climate change isn't real, just say there is no consensus. There is lack of scientific certainty. We need more studies. And I don't know if some of you remember back that far, but the Bush administration funded the CCSP reports. Yes. And no, I was involved in some. Bush 2 did too. Quite a few of them, actually. Oh yeah, this was Bush 1. Yes, you're right. Yes. But I believe that this memo was taken to heart.
Yes.
Yes. Because the CCSP reports, they're the most untapped resource I feel like nobody's ever read. I mean, these reports are amazing. There's like 18 or 20 of them. Hundreds of scientists spent, hundreds of hours writing these reports. What were they? I'm personally convinced, as an author of 2 of the reports, that they were make-work projects for scientists to keep us busy and happy because we weren't certain yet. And if you want any more information on this, I won't go into it in more detail, but the Merchants of Doubt book and movie, and a book that you might not be aware of that's written by a Canadian, Climate Cover-Up, written by Jim Hogan, who is a PR specialist. These 2 books go into great and excruciating detail on how our blank slates have been written on over the past 20 years. Moving on, though. We run into this issue that the solutions scare people, too. And the solutions are partisan. Because when we talk about climate solutions, what are the words that come up? Government legislation, taxes, control, loss of personal freedom and liberty. And as a Canadian, it took me a long time to connect the dots on this one. What was the American Revolution fought over? Exactly. So these things are burned into the American psyche. How can you expect people to say, oh, yes, taxes, yes. Oh, government legislation, absolutely. Like, how can you actually expect an entire country to say that? So in a sense, it's a bit unreasonable if these are the words being used to expect everybody to just be happy about it. So if we can't assume everybody thinks like we do, if we can't assume that everybody's going to understand what we say, and if we can't assume that more information will change people's minds, how do we talk about climate? Because I'm a scientist. I deal in data and facts. That's what I do. I've learned a lot over the past 10 years. I've learned it the hard way through getting dropped into the deep end. And I've learned it the slightly easier way with our Climate Science Center. We have a Climate Science Center, which is part of the DOI network of regional centers. At our Climate Science Center, I've been fortunate to interact with colleagues from every field of study. And one of my favorite colleagues at our Climate Science Center is from rhetoric, English. What he has taught me is that we as humans think in narratives. Whenever we're confronted with a situation that we're a little bit unfamiliar with, we immediately try to figure out what story does it follow. So we can slot in the characters, and then we can decide what our role is and how we respond. So what I've realized is that climate change is often presented, I think I have a slide on this, yes. Climate change, as Lindsey Graham points out so accurately, is often presented as what? Not a science, a belief, or a religion. And to find proof of this, you have to look no further than the internet, where we find this. I expect my head to be photoshopped onto the choir any day now. So when I speak to conservative groups, and absolutely when I speak to faith-based groups, the narrative that they have going in is that I am the false prophet for an earth-worshipping cult, Al Gore, high priest. It may not be explicit, but that is the narrative. So what I do is I immediately begin by disrupting the narrative, by saying, I don't fit into the false prophet category because, number one, I don't believe in global warming. And when I say that, people are like, what? What do you mean you don't believe in global warming? But I thought you studied. And then, and you'll see me do this tomorrow night. I'm kind of showing my hand here. Then I will go into the definitions of belief versus the definitions of science. They're completely different. They are not 2 opposing systems of belief. They are 2 very different ways of looking at the world, one based on evidence and observation and experiment, and the other based on, as Google says, spiritual apprehension. So immediately I've disrupted the narrative that people were about to slot me into so they could dismiss me. And that means I've got their attention for another 5 minutes. Now, I cannot tell you what narrative it is that whoever you're talking to, whether it is Uncle Joe, whether it's the neighbor, or whether it's a community group that you go to, I cannot tell you what their narrative is. But you can probably figure it out for yourself. The second thing I do is this. Rather than beginning with the head, as that talk that I just showed did, rather than beginning with the head, I do something completely different. And honestly, very uncomfortable as a scientist. I start with the heart. I must encourage you, though, the more you do it, the more comfortable it feels. And the more it helps all of our relationships. Because really, relationships are about connecting from here, not from here. How do we do this? 4 steps. I'm going to show you what they are, then I'm going to go through it with examples, and then circle back. Number 1, don't haul out the IPCC reports. Identify a genuine shared value, interest, or passion with that person or that group of people. It has to be genuine. It has to be one that you have. It has to be one they have too. Number 2, then connect that issue with climate change or whatever tough topic it is you want to talk about. This is a pretty general framework. You can apply it to any topic. Only at that point do any explaining, if you need to, and then conclude with solutions that we can agree with and work together on. Because social science, again, has showed that if we present a problem or a challenge to people, even something like weight loss, but we present it without a viable solution, like I live in a food desert and I can't get healthy food. So if we don't present a solution to the problem, people aren't going to accept the reality of the problem, because as a human, how does it feel like there's this huge problem and you are helpless and you can't do anything about it? How does that feel? It feels awful. So our defense mechanism is just to reject the reality of the problem. And this can happen in something as simple as nutrition, let alone an issue like climate change, which again is the most polarized issue in the United States, short of what you think of the president. So how can we bond? Well, I'm just going to give you some of my personal examples, and when I do, I want you to think of your own examples, okay? I used to fish. I used to fish all the time. I fished every single day from June to September from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m. I knew fish, yes. I was very serious about fishing. Do you fish? Do you hunt? Are you a birder? Are you somebody who spends time outdoors with a group or community of people? Winter sports. Goodness knows you can connect the dots on that to climate change. Are you a parent? If you are, you know that you do anything for your kids. Well, our kids are being impacted by this. It's their health and it's the future of their world. Last year, I was invited to speak to the Rotary Club in Lubbock, Texas. A lot of businessmen who weren't quite sure why this climate scientist got invited to talk to them. Luckily, I arrived a little bit early, and as I walked in, I'm not familiar with the Rotary Club. I wasn't ever a member. My family wasn't. I knew it existed, but I wasn't familiar with their 4-way test. I walk in, there's this big banner, and I look at it, and I realize this is climate change. Is it the truth? Yes. Is it fair to all concerned? Absolutely not. Would it build goodwill to do something about it? Yes. Would it be beneficial to all concerned to address it? Yes. So luckily, I had a bit of time, so I sat down with my computer and I rearranged my presentation. I put in 4 title slides of the 4-way test, and I went through the 4-way test. And you could see people were kind of looking at me like this when I first started. And then I came up with the question number 1. They're like, and then I got to question number 2, and they're like, and then my question number 3, like, and then at the end, a couple of people came up to me, and they said, I wasn't on board with this whole thing, but it passed the 4-way test. So sometimes you don't have to be a Rotarian to make it work. Faith communities. Over 80% of people in the United States belong to a faith community. And there is no greater source for the values we have in our heart of stewardship and of loving other people than our faith. The biggest thing I feel like I've learned personally over the last 10 years is that whether you are Protestant or Catholic, whether you are Muslim or Hindu, whether you are Buddhist or Baha'i or Jewish, Every single major world religion has at its core a fundamental concept of stewardship and of caring for other people who are poor or vulnerable or don't have the resources we do. So that is a powerful connector. But it doesn't connect all of us. I was up in British Columbia 2 years ago speaking at a conservative Christian college, and a fellow scientist came up to me afterwards and said, "This is great, and I've been trying to do this for a couple of years, but I just can't break into the local churches." This was in the Central Valley where it's quite conservative. He said, "I just can't get my foot in the door." How do you get your foot in the door? I said, "Well, you start with your denomination. You start with the people who know you." So I said, "Are you Presbyterian? Are you Catholic? Are you Anglican?" He looked at me and said, "I'm an atheist." I said, "Well, maybe that's not where you should be starting." We all have different genuine interests, values, passions, and loves. So look into your heart and figure out which are your unique ones. You do not have to be any of the things that I've put up here. Any of them. Although there is one great uniter, and that is the fact that we all live in a certain place. So even just the simple fact that we are all humans, we all live on this planet, we all live in this community of St. Paul, of Lubbock, Texas, of wherever it is, and we want the place where we live to be successful, to be healthy, to be a good place to live with our families. I mean, that's a core value that nearly all of us share. So bonding. Then next, connecting. How do we connect the dots? Well, skiing is a very easy way to connect the dots. Rising temperatures threaten our ski industry. Connecting the dots on our kids. There's the Moms Clean Air Force, there's Climate Parents, there's all kinds of organizations that connect the dots for us between our role as parents and the impact on our kids. What if somebody is in the military? Well, the national security of the United States is affected by climate change, and these reports are not being published by Greenpeace, they're being published by the Department of Defense, by the Pentagon. What if we care about the economy? Well, Michael Bloomberg has a report for that on the economic impacts of climate change. You see where we're kind of going with this. Let me give you some even more specific examples. This mouse does not like me. There we go. And I am a Mac person too. Okay, let me give you an example of an actual conversation. Because sometimes it's a bit hard to say, well, what do I actually say? Say that the bond is your kids. What have you done? You have bonded and you have acknowledged and appreciated the values that other person has. Respecting somebody and viewing them as a good person is the really important way to start. Did you know that between 3 to 6 million people, depending on what year you take the observations, between 3 to 6 million people, many of them children, die all around the world because of air pollution. About 5 million children die because of polluted water, including right here in the United States. That's why it's so important for us to figure out how to get ourselves off fossil fuels, is because it affects our kids. Little Joey has asthma, or I know your child does too. What if you're talking to a business leader? Thank you for your leadership in helping our state's economy grow and investing in our small businesses. What business leader doesn't want to hear that? But it has to be genuine. Don't say it if it isn't genuine. If you really can't get it out without choking, don't. Probably shouldn't even be talking to that person. Did you know that per megawatt hour, electricity from the wind and sun gives us 8 times more jobs right here in Texas where we live than the same energy from gas or coal or oil? What a great way to invest in our economy. I share your concerns about national security, and I appreciate how you stood up for our veterans' rights or how you served our country. Did you know the Department of Defense calls climate change a threat multiplier? Did you know that the Admiral of the South Pacific, who is in charge of the troops facing North Korea, when he was asked what is the greatest security threat facing the United States, he said climate change, not North Korea. And you may be like, really? And you're like, yes, he really did say that. You can see it helps to be prepared. And then what greater connector, again, is there than people's faith? Because when you look at the vulnerability to climate change, it is occurring in the very countries that did not contribute to the problem, the countries where people are already living off $1 or $2 a day. When the crops fail, they don't complain over the price of meat, they can't feed their family. In Texas, we have a lot of road signs, some of them written by God. apparently. But I like this one. This is a good one. So only then do we need to do any explaining. Only then do we need to get into it's real, it's us, scientists agree. Or get into why would we care about climate change? If we live in the East, we care about it because of rising sea levels and stronger coastal storms. If we live in the West, we care about it because of the beetles eating millions of acres of forest. If we live in the North, we care because what used to be permanently frozen ground is now crumbling and falling into the ocean, putting hundreds of villages at risk. If we live in the South, and this is happening in Houston today, although this picture is from Bangladesh, we care about extreme heavy rainfall. So we can explain these things, but only after we've bonded and we've connected. And then lastly, how can we work together to solve this problem in positive ways that are compatible with our values? Now, you may say, when you hear people say things like this, God's still up there. The arrogance of people to think that we would be able to change what he is doing to the climate is, to me, outrageous. Of course, he's published a book calling climate change the greatest hoax. If you looked at my Facebook page, I get an average of between probably 2 to 10 comments a day that sound just like this. Just like this, and sometimes a lot worse. So you might say, well, but how could I ever agree on a solution that he would agree on? Well, the same year, he said something a little different. In an interview with Rachel Maddow, he said, do you realize I was actually on your side on this issue when I first was chairing the committee? I was on your side until when? Until I found out how much it would cost. So there's issues of cost, and there's issues of the role of government in people's lives. Basically, climate change, in my opinion, is a casualty of the conflict between big versus small government. But I don't think it has to be, and I don't think it should be. So let me tell you what I mean. If you look at the Yale climate opinion maps, if you haven't seen these before, you should check them out. They're really fun. They break down public opinion by state, by county, and by congressional district. So they asked people, do you think that global warming is mostly caused by human activities? Anything that is blue is less than 50%. Anything that is orange or yellow is greater than 50%. If you're wondering what's going on with South Texas, I have one phrase for you, that is Hispanic Catholics. They are the most concerned people group about climate change in the entire country. But that's the topic for a different day. Most of the country is blue. So as a scientist, or as somebody working in the environmental area, when we look at this map, what do we say? More information, more communication campaigns, more outreach. We have to change people's minds on this. And I'm going to say something to you that you might not agree with, and it's going to sound really strange coming from me. I think we can move forward without agreeing on the science, to a certain extent. We're never going to agree about politics, ever. And it's going to take us a long time to agree about the science. But there are some indications that we might be able to agree on the solutions already. And I'm going to show you 3 more maps. Ready? Do you support regulating carbon dioxide as a pollutant? Now, why would you want to regulate carbon dioxide as a pollutant if you don't think it's causing climate change? I don't care. As long as we regulate it, that's fine, right? Do you support funding research into renewable energy? It's even darker. We're looking at 75 to 90% of the country. It's a no-brainer. Do you support requiring your state to produce renewable energy? Everybody says yes. So what could we do? We can agree, as the majority of people do in Texas where I live, we can agree that something is changing. They might not agree on why, but they definitely agree something's different. Number one, whether you live in Texas or whether you live in Bangladesh. We can agree that it makes sense to prepare for a changing future, whether it's in the Netherlands where they're building floating villages, so when sea level rises, you put a few more feet on the anchor chain, or in Texas where they're developing better ways to irrigate our crops so we don't waste so much water. And we can agree on investing in the new energy economy, whether it's in Africa where they've never had electricity before, or whether it's in Texas, this is where I live, where wind turbines are replacing oil rigs. all over the place. Why? Not for green reasons. They're replacing, well, not for those type of green reasons, for the other type of green reason, because it just makes economic sense. In Texas, we already get about 20% of our electricity from wind on average. We can inspire people with visionary technology like the solar bike paths they're putting in the Netherlands. We all love new technology. My husband loves it most of all. And he always gets the new iPhone as soon as it comes out. And 2 years ago, we went back home to Canada for Christmas, and he had just gotten the new iPhone. And we were shopping in the mall for Christmas presents, and there was a lineup of 200 people outside the Apple store waiting, because Canada's always just slightly behind on the iPhone. So what did he do? He pulls out his iPhone, and he walks down the row. Now, were those people there because they should be there, because it's good for the environment to be there, because it's really the best thing you could do? No, they were there because they wanted new technology. There are ways to harness this desire for new technology for our good, and this is one of them. And we can inspire with tangible local benefits. For example, in Utah, one of the biggest inspirations is, hey, we can clean up our air pollution. So rather than talking about all the downers, which come so naturally to us as scientists, you've probably seen this cartoon before, but I had to show it again. What if this whole thing is a hoax? What if we never agree on the science? What are the terrible consequences of acting on climate change? There are a lot of good things that we could all agree on. So what can we do? We can bond over shared values. We can connect them to climate. We can explain only then and only if we have to what people need to know if they want to know. But we must find ways to work together by connecting our head to our heart. And, in the words of Jane Goodall, it's only when our clever brain and our human heart work together in harmony that we as humans and as scientists and as researchers can achieve our full potential. Thank you.
I have so many questions, so I'm sure you all do too. So let's get to it. Please keep your questions short, because I'm sure others will want to ask too. So no speeches. I will cut you off.
Katharine, can you comment on the phenomenon that people tend to become climate doubters if they belong to a group that has that as a norm, and they're afraid to go against the group norm?
Yes, that's a great way to put it. So a word that we hear a lot in the social science literature is tribalism. And we have to recognize we all belong to tribes. It isn't just that person I disagree with who's part of a tribe. I'm part of a tribe too. What we're talking about here is really intertribal communication. And we have to realize that people don't really want to leave their tribes, and I don't think they have to leave their tribes, because it's a lot easier to say, you know what, you in this tribe over here, which is distinct from mine, or maybe we overlap a little bit, you have all the values you already need to care about climate change. We just need to connect the dots. And you stay in your tribe because you retain those values that are core to who you are, to your identity, and to your social network, but they are also core to caring about climate change. There's hardly any tribe you can think of that doesn't have some core values that do connect directly to climate change. It's a lot easier than saying to somebody, your tribe is no good. Your tribe is selfish and greedy. Your tribe is ignorant. You know, insert negative adjective. Your tribe is blank. You must leave your tribe and come over here. Nobody is going to do that. So it's a huge communication issue. We're not trying to get people to move tribes. We're trying to get every tribe to realize, whatever tribe you're in, you live on this planet. There is no tribe yet that lives on any other planet. And so just in that simple fact, we have the values we need to care about our planet and our home. Thank you. Right back. And then over here.
Thank you for your talk. So you gave a number of examples of social science studies that have shown that, you know, trying to put knowledge into people's heads is not effective. But I wonder if any of your colleagues have studied your approach to see, you know, to quantify how effective alternative approaches are. I mean, I know some anecdotal examples, but I was wondering if you probably are more up to date. So,
yes, that is a concern of mine, because if what I'm doing doesn't work, why am I doing it? And I actually studied. we're submitting the paper right now, so I don't want to give too many details, but we studied a leading environmental figure who speaks regularly at universities and writes frequently, and we actually studied student exposure and their level of concern based on the 6 Americas of global warming. And we found with this speaker, who does not employ a faith perspective, that on average, students' level of concern dropped after exposure, which was devastating to me personally. So I got pretty worried, and along came a guy who was a sustainability coordinator at a small Christian college in upstate New York, who was doing a master's degree at Harvard. And at the same time, out of the blue, he emailed me and said, I want to use you to run an experiment. And I said, I am there, because I really want to know. So we ran an experiment where one group of students attended my talk, one group of students attended an identical video of that talk, and then a third group of students attended a talk that didn't have a lot of the myths and misconceptions in it, because we were trying to see if myths and misconceptions makes a difference or not. Because it does in some scientific research. If you present the mental model people have and you say, this is why the seasons happen, you have to say they don't happen because we're closer to the sun, because then everybody would be in summer. So you present the myth and the misconception first, and that works in certain cases. So we studied that first of all, and we found there was a significant improvement in every group, and the myths didn't make a big difference. And now we just ran 2 more experiments at 2 more conservative Christian colleges, where we took the video and we put a faith frame on it, and then we took the faith frame out. And that experiment just got run 2 weeks ago, and I do not know what the results are. I try not to be too involved because I'm the subject, right? So I try to stay away. Yes, you had a question over there.
I have 2 questions. I think I can make them quickly. My background's philosophy and medicine, so my whole life has been interdisciplinary, and being in a field which everyone thinks is just an ignorant field.
Hold it a little closer to your mouth.
This part. Oh, this part. All right, now
There
we're
you
here.
go. Yes.
And there are 2 questions. One is, I really like your talk, and you, and how you present these things, and what you're drawing on. At the same time, I have 2 reservations. The first is, since I've worked a lot in interprofessional work, and you didn't mention at work, the consequences for at work. You did skiing, home, things like that, hunting. But you didn't mention hunting. But anyway, but out there are thousands upon thousands of engineers, medical people, architects, and so on, some of whom are working on this, but many are not. And they're actually quite torn about how to cope with this. Chemical engineering is based entirely on fossil fuels. And to totally revise that, we heat our houses with fossil fuels here. And to switch over to electricity is generally a bad idea, judging from housing engineering and so on. There are all of these kinds of things that are intellectual. They're not science. You have scientists and non-scientists. Lots of the non-scientists are intellectual people. We might not worry too much about public attitude. Maybe we should be worrying about the specialists. So I wanted to ask you about that. The other question, you want it now or after?
Hit me with it now.
Oh, it's a terrible question. And
Never mind.
it's
Never
partly
mind.
yeah, that's because I've worked mainly in a job where we look at death all the time. And bad news. And I remember that actually, say, Physicians of Social Responsibility did a lot many years ago, got a Nobel Prize too, for moving people along on nuclear weapons. How'd they do it? They scared people. And thinking of old stories, the communist scare scared people. Look how many politicians are making points about scaring people now, scaring them about migrants, scaring them about non-religious people, scaring them about differently religious people, scaring them about gender identity. People thrive on fear.
Yeah.
Why should we not take advantage of fear? Because there's plenty to fear. So that's first question is, what about sticking with the brain some? That's one way to help with fear. And second, why not more fear?
Yes. Those are fantastic questions. They really are.
Well, thank you.
Yes. You obviously do it well. Question number 1, what about professional people who are actually engaged in professional activities that relate to climate change adaptation or mitigation? That is what I do. No, I know. But
People who don't, the architects building houses,
Oh.
engineers designing automobiles.
I know, I get the point. Yes. I understand. the major hierarchical organizations, the American Association of Civil Engineers, the Department of Transportation, the National Institute of Health, the American Physicians, I forget their name, but who just released a report on climate change, the American Psychological Association, American College of Physicians. The hierarchical professions, the leadership gets it. There are hardly any, there are a few, but there's hardly any hierarchical technical professions where the leadership doesn't get it. And so it is filtering down, but the primary limitation right now on mitigation is not having a price on carbon that is transparent. And so the way to move quickly is by changing policy. And policy has to happen through changing public opinion. And so, like I said, 60% of what I do is working with hierarchical professional associations to integrate climate planning and to educate people on, and education does work in those contexts often. Speaking to hydrologic engineers, talking about historical trends and future projections, they get it. And it often does work because we're in a professional context. But that is not what is going to change things fast enough, and that is really a key issue, is the speed at which we need to act. We don't have time. And then the second issue about fear. Fear is being used. Fear is definitely being used. Anybody seen The Day After Tomorrow? Yeah, it's being used. It had an impact. The Day After Tomorrow actually had a positive impact, at least from our perspective, on people's opinions about climate change. And it was a very fearful movie. But fear is, there's two things about fear. Number one is it is being used very effectively against climate action. People are scared to death of what they are going to lose if we act on climate, number one. Number two, social studies have looked at fear, and they've showed that one of the reasons why coverage of climate change has dropped in the last 10 years, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, is because people are oversaturated on the fear, because the same fear has been talked about now for 30 years in the public media. It's like we're saturated. We can't go on talking about the same fear for 30 years without a solution. We change fears. If you look at CNN, if you look at the politicians, they have several different fears they touch on, and it has shifted quite rapidly from year to year. So that is not what's going to move us forward at this time. In fact, that's actually holding us back, because too much fear actually induces anxiety, which induces disassociation. And that has actually been measured, that people are disassociating. Even if they're on board with the science, they disassociate because of overexposure to fear, which is kind of crazy. All right, I think we have time for one or two quick more questions. Yes, but you need a microphone.
I have it.
Oh, you have it. Okay, you're next, and then you're last.
Quick question. This bonding piece and that communicate, like talking with others across difference, I think requires empathy to be able to have that empathetic. And I'm wondering whether you have ideas about how we teach and instill that in our colleagues, in our students, in the people we're interacting with.
Isn't that a sad question? It's true. It requires empathy. It requires respect. It requires considering the other person to be worthy of our time, of our attention, and of our time listening to them. So I had a crash course in empathy because, as I told you, I accidentally married somebody who didn't think climate change was real. And so, when you're in that relationship, you haven't been married that long, you have great incentive to be empathetic. And it all worked out great. He changed his mind. We wrote a book together. It's all good. It took about 2 years, though. It wasn't fast. So I feel like empathy is something that answers a lot of our problems, because we're in this polarized society, we're in this tribal society, where we almost view people not in our tribe as not quite even human. And that's just so sad. So I would say the best way that I personally have experienced growth in that area is to be in a relationship and consciously seek out relationships with people, whether it's lunch or coffee, whether it's working together or collaborating, whether it's being with our kids on play dates, to seek out those relationships with people who I don't have much in common with, and listen to them and try to understand. And I've learned some great things about guns living in Texas from good friends who, we are miles apart in our perspective on guns, but I understand where they're coming from now. And I'm like, I understand why you feel that way. That does make sense. I don't agree with you on the solution, but I agree with you about your concerns. But we can only develop this by actually taking the time, and most of us don't, because we have busy lives and there isn't that much extra time to spend. And it can be frustrating too and challenging. It's not easy. Last.
Yeah, my question is, what gives you hope, and where do you draw motivation to keep doing this work?
Perfect question to end on. What gives me hope is the opposite of your question. What gives me hope are people. When I see the amazing things people are doing. I have an opportunity to travel a fair amount and talk to people, find out what's happening. Cool stories. I follow Skeptical Science on Facebook. Now, those of you who are scientists are probably familiar with Skeptical Science. They provide scientific answers to a lot of common questions about climate change. But on their Facebook page, they post news stories, and they post a lot of positive stories. I read the positive stories. I make a point of reading almost every positive story I could find about whether, Fort Hood has gone all solar and wind, or Morocco just put in the biggest solar plant, or up here in Minnesota you have a little evangelical church that put solar panels on the roof, or, that's what I try to do, is follow those hopeful stories. And my hope too, personally, again, comes from what's in my heart, not what's in my head. Last summer there was a lot of stories about the existentialist despair of climate scientists, about our depression and anxiety when we look at these rapidly melting ice sheets and rising sea levels and incredibly temperature records being broken month after month after month after month, to the point where we're almost inured to breaking records. I mean, science doesn't give us hope. It doesn't. It causes us to despair and get depressed. But what's in our hearts gives us hope. So whether what's in your heart is your faith, as it is in mine, your values, your sense of community, your love for other people, it's our hearts where the hope comes from. And that's why it's so important to connect the two.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Hayhoe. And I encourage all of you, tell your families, your friends, your neighbors, come on out tomorrow night, Thursday night, 7 p.m., St. Paul Student Center. I will say just a couple quick announcements here. There is a reception down the hall. Please let our speaker go down the hall, and then you can ask your questions there. We've had receptions where the speaker is stuck in here, so please let her go down the hall first. Then ask your questions. Finally, next week we wind up Frontiers with a fascinating discussion. How can nature and design improve our mental health? So please come back for that next Wednesday at noon here. Thank you, and we'll meet you just down the hall for the reception. Yeah, walk in. Lewis is good.